It's the week ending Saturday the 20th of August, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the UK hitting double-digit inflation for the first time in 40 years, the suspect charged with stabbing Sir Salman Rushdie praising the Ayatollah who issued the fatwa, and the death of Hollywood leading lady Anne Heche at the age of 53. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann. Let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the week's digital team is Kate Samuelson and the boss man, Holden Frith. Plus, how exciting, we have a new panellist, everybody. It is co-host of the One Decision podcast, journalist Julia Macfarlane. Hello, Julia.
Hi, Ollie. Thanks for having me.
Now, Julia, as is tradition on this show, I'd like you to tell me one thing that we would not be able to find about you if we Googled you.
I mean, so much of my life is tragically Googleable because I'm so perennially online. But I guess one thing that I don't tend to talk about is the fact that I have a phobia of windmills or wind farms, I should say. And it wasn't something I realised until they started popping up everywhere around Scotland, but they absolutely terrify me, and I don't know why that is.
What is it? Is it triggering some latent traumatic memory, or?
I don't know. I mean, well, my father suggested that maybe it was like a film that we may have watched when I was growing up about like a paraglider who maybe got tangled in one of them. But I don't think that's, I mean, I'm never paragliding near wind farms, so I don't know. But they freak me out because they are so alien. They look so wrong, and they're too damn big. They're just too big. And the noise that they make is like really scary. And every time I drive past them,
you can tell you're younger than me, because when I think of windmills, I just think of Jonathan Creek and Round the Twist and reassuring things. Julia, you're up first. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
China's economy is doing badly, and it is getting closer to home.
Well, I think, as Tom says, protests aren't unusual in and of themselves, but I think the speed and the tactic of both of these sort of protests have been unusual. Boycotts are an unusual form of collective action. It's unusual to see them spread across provinces. And of course, because the nature of developers, the nature of their developers having projects in many different provinces, usually in China, has meant that there was this very kind of quick call to action on various platforms, although we've seen many of them since censored.
Journalist Rebecca Chung-Wilkins speaking on China Has a Mortgage Problem, a panel discussion hosted by Bloomberg on Twitter Spaces last month. Julia, what was she talking about?
So basically, I mean, China's property market is in a lot of trouble, and we know this has been on the cards for a while. We were all talking about Evergrande, which is the world's biggest construction company. They have been in absolute dire straits because they are really, really struggling with a liquidity crisis. But it's more than that now, and it's really spiraling out of control. I mean, since Evergrande started defaulting on its payments, we've had 30 property firms default since the beginning of last year. And so the problem is so much bigger than this one company that we have been talking about. And basically what happened was, when the Chinese economy was booming, it was powered mostly by property. Property firms in China, they couldn't build enough houses to keep up with demand. And so developers borrowed a ton of money. And that's fine if you're booming and everyone's making profits. But then the property market started to slow down.
Okay, so what's happened this week?
So this week we got some really depressing results out of China. They posted their figures on spending and output, and retail is down, industrial production is down, investment is down, housing sales are down, crude steel output is down, everything is down basically. And so the central bank decided to cut two of its key interest rates, which analysts are saying that they're not convinced that will really help much, because it's not the cost of borrowing in China that's the problem, it's the lack of demand. But it shows that the Chinese authorities are getting really worried about this.
And Holden, what numbers most jumped out at you from the ones that were released this week?
There was a whole barrage of numbers, as Julia mentioned. I think one of the most eye-catching was the youth unemployment figure, which is now up to nearly 19%, which, given what I think the preconceptions we have about the Chinese economy is really quite surprising. And another that really leapt out, which wasn't specifically from this week, but has taken on added significance because of it, is the fact that apparently 70% of all household wealth in China is tied up in the homes that people own. So when you see the signs of a housing crash, and you see people actually taking the risks of refusing to pay mortgages on houses that they're now not going to be able to take ownership of, you get the sense that this is something that really could have political consequences as well as economic ones.
Yeah, so there was this widespread mortgage boycott, wasn't there, Kate? People actually just refusing en masse to pay their mortgages. And yet, like a lot of things about China, that wasn't widely reported in the West. Do we need to pay more attention to what's going on over there?
So it is really important that we pay attention to what's going on in China. It's now the biggest economy in the world, recently taking over the US. And as you said, interestingly, there were these widespread protests across the country recently, which is something quite unusual to happen in China. And it wasn't as widely reported on as perhaps it should have been. What happened was buyers in hundreds of unfinished projects around the country took to social media, and also kind of more old school methods of protest too. They met up in person, warning that they'd stop paying their mortgages until their homes were completed. And it swiftly became a mortgage boycott and was backed by hundreds of thousands of middle-class Chinese people. And it was actually estimated by ANZ, the banking group, that 1.5 trillion won worth of mortgage loans could be affected by the boycott. And The Guardian described it as yet another sign that the faith of ordinary Chinese people in the property market and wider banking industry is beginning to dissolve.
It's interesting in relation to what we were discussing last week, Julia, with quiet quitting having originated as a trend in China, this idea of turning up at work and not really trying to do anything above and beyond your mandated hours in your job. Taken together, it says something very different about what particularly maybe younger people in China feel about their nation's reputation for productivity, doesn't it? You know, if you've got this situation where they're possibly not paying their mortgages and not doing their jobs like they used to.
Right. The Chinese middle class, who are sort of the bulk of homeowners. And back, after the financial crisis when borrowing was cheap, and because the Chinese real estate market was seen as a good investment, you had a lot of families buying second, even third homes. As Holden said, 70% of household wealth in China is tied up in property. And so, for a lot of Chinese people, this is their retirement plan. This is their life savings. And when the value of these assets starts going through the floor, it is a profound political risk. I mean, it affects a lot of people, obviously, but it's a profound political risk for President Xi. And I mean that the importance of the Chinese property market, it is the biggest investment asset class in the world. It's over $60 trillion in size. And just to put that in perspective, the entire US banking assets total $23 trillion in comparison, which is a paltry fraction of that. And also, these protests are so unusual because protests aren't common in China. Mass protests don't happen very often. And the fact that they're starting to break out in a number of cities across China, it's really, really bad news for Xi Jinping. And don't forget, this is an important time for him, because we're coming up to the 20th Party Congress, which is happening in November, and he's hoping to be coronated for his unprecedented third term in power. And so the fact that he needs to get a handle on this crisis is putting more pressure on his leadership.
Right. I mean, what's also unusual, Kate, I mean, we were talking about how this isn't being reported in the UK, but of course, a lot of this isn't reported in China either, because they have a state grip on the media that people consume. And yet these protests are still happening.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Somewhat unsurprisingly, as these boycotts against mortgage payments have began gaining traction across the country, Chinese censors have been scrambling to remove mentions of these boycotts from social media. And that's involved things like deleting posts which have listed the delayed projects, and as well as the kind of personal testimonies of many angry home buyers. And also documents sharing links, which have been a really important way of people showing the extent of the protests and the issues all around the country, they've been blocked in the country and banned, and that's included overseas document sharing platforms like Google Docs as well. And some protesters have even said that they've been contacted by the police who've warned them against posting on social media. But the Japan Times pointed out that the breadth of the support and the speed with which these protests have spread really show the Chinese people aren't afraid to band together on a national scale, especially when, quote unquote, their treasured homes are at stake.
And there may also be, Holden, a knock-on from all of this, improbably if you're not an economist, with oil prices. Can you explain that to us?
Yes, and this actually may be a sort of slim sliver of good news, because I mean, good news resulting from bad news, so it's more of a sort of silver lining, if anything. But it's because Chinese growth is much lower than expected, and because their economy is really kind of struggling to recover, particularly because there is this sort of looming threat of COVID lockdowns hanging over it, then they're using much less oil than had been expected. And so this is leading to lower oil prices for the rest of the world. And this obviously comes at a time when the high cost of oil has been a huge problem, both in terms of energy prices, but then sort of knock-on effect on food prices and cost of everything else that has to be transported around the world. So it is giving a little bit of relief on that front, although less in the kind of European energy markets that we're very conscious of, because that's more about gas than oil.
You also wonder, Kate, once they've got an appetite for showing any kind of rebellion at all, whether there might be more of a public opposition to policies like zero COVID, which, has been bubbling along in the background with some quite severe lockdowns over the past few years. And, if they keep trying to chase it, will continue for a few more years as well, adding further pressure.
Yeah, life for ordinary people in China has been pretty difficult over the last few years. And obviously these intense lockdowns, which have been stricter than pretty much anywhere else in the world, have made things extremely tough. And I think there's also another side to what we're talking about as well, kind of connected to what Holden was saying. I was really interested to read that China has traditionally had the highest proportion of young homeowners in the world. I think around 70% of Chinese millennials were found to be on the property ladder in 2017. And that's actually a huge part of Chinese culture, because for young people who want to marry, owning a home is considered a kind of must before they start a family. So if all these young people who traditionally have been able to move out of their family home at a pretty young age compared to their counterparts in other countries are now not able to move out and are stuck at home, what does that mean for their relationships, for their futures, and generally what does that really mean for Chinese society as a whole?
And Julia, finally on this, it's all very interesting, but for those of us who don't live in China, what does it mean for us?
Yeah, I just also want to point out, it's not just mortgage strikes and protests that are happening across China. There's the whole situation, the whole economic situation facing the housing market is leading to these additional ramifications with those banks that have lent out a lot of money for these very troubled developers. There were mass demonstrations in the city of Zhangzhou last month because thousands of people had not been able to withdraw any of their deposits, any of their savings for months. A lot of banks have had to freeze a lot of deposits because they are worried about a run on the banks. And then we can also then talk about the risk of capital flight. We have the situation in Hong Kong. There's been a mass exodus in Hong Kong, and also the fact that the Chinese economy is slowing down means a lot of people are actually trying to get their money out of China. And I spoke to a friend of mine who is based in Canada, but he runs a firm based in China, and he's had a lot of his colleagues, he says, have been willing to take significant haircuts on their net worth in order to get out of China and get their money out of China.
One other thing, I think, taking an even bigger step back, I think it's sort of, this is a sort of crude characterization, but I think it's basically fair to say that the Chinese government's bargain with its population has been that in return for going along with this quite restrictive way of life in China, the government will provide people with economic opportunity and social stability. And that has really depended on the kind of long-term growth in GDP, which now looks unsustainable. And if you couple that with the sense that people don't have confidence in the value of their investments, i.e. their house, and in some cases are paying for houses that are now never going to be built, there's a real sense of the second part of that equation, the social stability side, may also be looking a little bit more wobbly.
I mean, I think conversations like this are so important. And I think we don't have this kind of conversation a lot because I think a lot of us don't come from a business background or an economic background. And so by its nature, talking about anything to do with markets or anything is quite daunting for a lot of us. And I mean, certainly for me, I mean, I didn't really know what a bond was before I interviewed a Chinese economic analyst a few months ago. I had to Google what is a government bond to try and prepare myself for it. But it is so important because so much of our national economies around the world are predicated on the seemingly endless appetite and demand from China, but also China being able to export goods to all of us. We have relied on cheap Chinese goods. We've relied on having this ridiculously fast growing market to power world growth. And part of the reason why the stats that came out this week are so problematic is because everyone was hoping that July was going to be the good month, right? So the Chinese, they started easing down on a lot of their lockdowns last month. They started opening up again. Everyone was banking on good numbers coming out of China. And the fact that the numbers are down and worrying, and the fact that the little growth that they saw in the second quarter has now seemed to dissipate, it's putting a lot of analysts' predictions out of whack.
Okay, we're going to take a short pause so that everyone can Google what is a government bond. And then, Holden, I'm coming to you after this. Okay, Holden, your turn. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
Are we finally going back to the future?
It's about time. Time to turn the past into the present. Time to create the world's fastest airliner, optimized for speed, safety, and sustainability.
Meet Overture's refined design, a video from Boom Supersonic. Now, Holden, I wouldn't necessarily want to get on any plane called Boom, but apparently American Airlines thinks differently.
Yeah, and that all sounded very swish, and we've probably all seen many similarly ambitious-looking projects on paper or on screen, but this one actually took quite a big step towards reality on Tuesday when, as you say, American Airlines announced a solid commitment by 20 of these Boom supersonic aircraft, providing that they meet safety and reliability requirements.
So that sounds like it would cost a lot of money. What kind of cash are we talking?
Yeah, we don't know the exact financial terms here, but yeah, this is a sort of serious commitment, and it will have involved a substantial amount of money. United Airlines has also committed to buying 15 of these aircraft, and both airlines have the option to buy 35 or 40 more of them if they come to market.
Okay, so we've talked before about, could we see a return to supersonic flight, after Concorde's been, what's the polite term, rested for so long? But it seems like now the answer is actually yes. This isn't speculative anymore. We are going to see supersonic planes again, are we? Where are they going to go?
I imagine they will initially focus on the transatlantic routes, so London to New York, Paris to New York, just because that's where the most money is, and also they're critically over the oceans, so they can go above the speed of sound without disturbing people with a sonic boom.
Yeah.
But they will be flying at more than 1,300 miles per hour, so that means London to New York would be 3.5 hours, so not quite as fast as Concorde, but very nearly. Also, LA to Sydney would be 6 hours, 45 minutes instead of 15 hours. And so there's a real step forward in speed here. And it does, as you say, it really does look like this is going to come to market. They're intended to go into production in 2024 with test flights starting 2 years after that. And the first commercial flight is expected in 2029.
Okay, Kate, this may be a step forward in technology. It's got to be a step backwards for the environment, hasn't it?
Yeah, so historically, supersonic jets have come under a lot of criticism from environmentalists because they tend to burn a lot more fuel per passenger than comparable planes. But interestingly, the Overture jet is being designed to run fully on sustainable aviation fuel or a blend. I can't claim to fully understand exactly how it's going to work, but
You haven't got that side hustle at Rolls-Royce pinned down just yet.
no, sadly not. But I have read that Boom has announced an agreement with Climeworks, which is a leader in carbon dioxide removal through something called direct air capture, or DAC. And according to Forbes, as part of this agreement, Climeworks is going to remove a part of the supersonic jet's residual CO2 emissions from the atmosphere and then permanently store it underground. And that will actually help Boom achieve net zero carbon by 2025.
But is that just greenwashing, Julia? Because even if they're using more sustainable fuel, even I, as a complete kind of bystander on this with a passing interest in aviation, know that they're going to have to burn a lot more of it. It's going to discount any savings they're making environmentally.
Right. I mean, supersonic jets, they go a lot faster and they also go a lot higher in the atmosphere. So the amount of fuel that they consume is a lot more than subsonic jets. And so one issue is that even if, they say we've got, we consume green fuel, that's one thing, but they are still consuming a lot of fuel. And I mean, I find that the whole thing about aviation is interesting because I read that just over 2% of global CO2 emissions come from aviation, which doesn't sound like a lot. But mile for mile, it is the most damaging way to travel for the climate. And, a return flight from London to San Francisco emits more than twice the emissions produced by a family car in a whole year. A flight from London to Berlin emits 3 times the amount of emissions saved from a year of recycling. So the fact that these jets take so much in order to get up in the air a lot higher and a lot faster, that also has ramifications for the fact that they're hugely inefficient. And that was the death knell for Concorde, that they just cost too much money. All of the seats in Concorde were first class. You can't fly anything lower than first class. And so it costs a fortune. I read that a typical 767 jet costs about $15,000 to run per hour. So on a long haul flight, each ticket needs to be sold for around $400, $500 on average to make that viable.
But these are all private businesses now, Holden. And I suppose, yes, this might expose that their business model is satisfying their richest clients and bollocks to the environment. But that's sort of obvious from how they sell their seats on a normal jumbo jet, isn't it? All the profit is in first class and business class. So there's nothing new there. It just undermines their claims, doesn't it, to be investing in making flying greener?
I think there's different bits of that argument to pull apart. Partly, I think that there is an element of greenwashing, or at least they very clearly feel they have to answer the environmental question. And partly that is not a particularly satisfactory answer, because the direct carbon capture, there would always be the argument, well, why don't you just do that anyway and not fly this plane at this 1.7 times the speed of sound? I think the more real argument you can make on behalf of this whole project is that it is going to result in much more efficient engines because of the economics of Concorde, which we talked about. It never really worked as a private venture. It was only because British Airways and Air France were government owned at the time that they sort of had their arms twisted to fly it at a loss. Whereas this has to make it work. And the company says that operating costs will be a quarter of what they were for Concorde. That's partly because it's so much lighter, because it can be made from carbon fiber now rather than metal, but it's also because engine technology has moved on dramatically in the 50 years since Concorde was developed. So we may actually end up with more efficient engines on conventional subsonic aircraft as a result of this. And I think on the point more broadly about the kind of environmental cost of flying, it clearly is substantial, but it is also the most difficult to replace. Like that 2% of emissions are really difficult to decarbonize. Whereas if you look at the whole picture, then road transport and domestic heating together account for 30% of those emissions. And those are much easier to address with technology we have today. And so I think the benefits to flying, whether it's the sort of social benefits, the cultural benefits, the ability to go out into the world and see it, which also probably has an intangible effect on people's desire to save the world. I think that, we have to work out where we spend our emissions budget, then spending some of that on this sort of very innovative and inspiring technology may well be a cost worth paying.
I should just declare Holden's hand for him, since he hasn't himself fully, if it's not obvious. He is a plane geek. So I'm curious, Holden, what was the reaction to this news on all of your plane nerd forums? Did people think this was great, or did they even there sound some cynical notes?
I can't confess to being a member of a plane nerd forum, although I will accept that I am a plane nerd. But no, I mean, I think that the general reaction to this has actually probably been slightly underwhelmed because there have been so many promises of supersonic aircraft or even hypersonic, sort of next generation beyond that, which we did talk about on the podcast a few years ago with a Boeing concept aircraft, which looks like it may never get beyond being a concept. So I think that the fact that this actually has made several steps beyond that and really does look like it's going to take to the skies will take people by surprise when it does eventually materialize.
I mean, comfort is going to be an issue, isn't it, as well, Kate? And this is one of the things people used to say about Concorde is that, it's the height of glamour and all the rest of it because you might be sitting next to David Frost or Joan Collins or whatever. But in reality, you didn't have much legroom and you were paying thousands of pounds for your seats. I wonder whether the Instagram generation is going to be happy enough with that. Or do they need to make these super luxe to get people to pay out?
Well, I think if people are paying between $4,000 to $5,000 to fly from New York to London, which is what estimates are suggesting ticket prices will be, I think people would be expecting better legroom than a short-haul Ryanair flight, for example. But, we've talked about how unaffordable we imagine these jets to be for everyday passengers, and it's more likely that they'll be used more for business travellers, who I imagine would be expecting a degree of luxury. We're talking about Concorde, but that, as Holden pointed out, was development for that began around 50 years ago. I imagine that, with the latest technology and developments that have been made since then, we are going to see a higher degree of comfort in these jets.
I agree, but I'm just gonna disagree slightly because I feel like if it's gonna be shorter to fly to the US than it will be to take a train to Edinburgh, then if you're in the plane for a shorter amount of time, maybe you don't need to have a seat that goes fully back. And I think for a lot of business people who travel back and forth, the fact that it can take like 8 hours to get to Chicago or 8 hours to Washington, or 7 to New York, and sometimes you have to have an overnight flight transatlantically. If you can just pop across in 3 hours, I think a lot of people will be willing to take that, especially if it's a trip they have to do more often and to have that shorter legroom.
Yeah, if I'm getting less legroom, I at least want a scratch card. But wouldn't it be better, Julia, to invest in electric planes when all's said and done, if you're talking about the future of aviation?
Yeah, and I think that would make a huge amount of difference for how damaging mile per mile flying is for our carbon footprint, for emissions. I mean, there is a lot of work going into battery powered planes. I think we'll be seeing them later on a commercial basis than these supersonic jets. But I mean, if I just bring some of my experience into this, I mean, I was born in Jakarta, which is the capital of Indonesia, and every day in Jakarta, there are 400 new motorcycle licenses issued. And now if you go into Jakarta, it's one of the most polluted cities in the world. The smog and the fumes are so bad that you don't see a blue sky in Jakarta unless there's a public holiday and a lot of the traffic stops. And so what I wish there would be a lot more development on is like electric scooters and making those electric scooters affordable, especially in developed countries. You get cities like, Lagos or Jakarta or Dhaka, and you have, old cars, old buses that are billowing huge amounts of smoke. And I think if we could somehow get a lot of electric local engines, whether it's scooters or minibuses, I think that would have a huge impact for the environment. If that's an area that a lot of this innovation could be focused in, it has a huge amount of potential good to be done in those areas.
And when it comes to electric planes versus supersonic, I don't think it has to be one or the other. And United has also recently ordered 200 small, short-range electric propeller-driven planes, and they're actually expected to be delivered at around about the same time as this supersonic plane. And I think both of these are going to be niche technologies in the short term. But taking an optimistic view, what I think we'll see is that both of them feed into the more conventional long-range aircraft we see. And so hopefully they will end up being cleaner, greener, and perhaps faster too.
Okay, Kate, you're up next after this. Okay, Kate, you're finishing the show. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
A stars for exam cheaters on the toughest A-level results day in living memory.
Log into UCAS Track, as we may still have been able to confirm your place on the course you originally applied for, or we may have made you an alternative offer. If you don't have any offers, you may still be able to apply to study a new course via a process called clearing. Make a list of courses. Take a look at the USW website to find other suitable courses that are in clearing. Call or chat to us. We can talk you through your options and suggest suitable alternatives for you to consider. Find your tomorrow through clearing.
Results Day and Clearing in 60 seconds, a video from the University of South Wales. Kate, most of us yesterday saw lots of images of young people opening envelopes on the telly, but what's behind the story?
So this week marked A-level results day, a much anticipated and quite terrifying day in the life of 18-year-olds and their parents across the country. And this year's candidates were the first to sit exams since 2019 due to COVID. And while the classes of 2020 and 2021 had their grades assigned by teachers, this year it was different and they were back to exams. And in the build-up to Results Day, there was lots of scaremongering. For example, UCAS told students to prepare themselves for lower grades and increase competition for places. And there was talk that there might be record numbers of students trying to get last-minute spots via clearing. So for my story this week, I thought it would be interesting to explore why A-levels have been so competitive this year, as well as a really interesting op-ed that was published on Monday by Lee Elliott Major, a professor of social mobility at Exeter University, which claimed that increased competition could lead to more students actually cheating to secure their university places.
And cheating in ways that I certainly wasn't anticipating when I read an article like that. I mean, he was talking about not just, for example, contacting essay farms or essay mills or whatever they're called in other countries, getting people to write your essay for you, but even going as far as to fake a disability so that you could get extra time in the exams.
Yeah, so according to Lee Elliott Major, there are lots of different ways that students can gain unfair advantages. And some of the methods are fairly well reported on and kind of old school sort of things along the lines of smuggling phones into exam halls or getting help with coursework from parents and teachers and friends. And also what you mentioned, using these kind of cheating websites. But he also pointed out that increasing numbers of young people are being diagnosed with conditions like dyslexia, ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or other conditions which entitle them to 25% extra time in exams, and sometimes the use of smart drugs which improve concentration.
I mean, I suppose perversely, Julia, this is good news for universities that they're being so sought after. You know, there were many years where people were saying, yeah, they're going to be charging more for student fees. There aren't going to be so many students from overseas coming over because of Brexit. And actually, they're going to be struggling to attract people. It seems like people are prepared to forge all kinds of things that they can get in.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say that the cheating aspect of this story just reminds me of something that came up last month in Lebanon, where a local drug lord's son tried to cheat during his exam by barging into the school flanked by gunmen, and he kept his phone on him during the exam and threatened the teachers. So at least we don't tend to have that kind of cheating in the UK.
It's a bit more extreme than writing a couple of equations on the inside of a calculator case, isn't it?
Yeah. The maths of university places and funding is is tricky and complicated. And I think it's made difficult for some courses like medicine, which is very subsidized by the government. And so that's why they keep numbers down, or the number of students that they admit. One might ask, at a time when we are really struggling to get enough doctors and nurses in the National Health Service, perhaps there really needs to be more done to be able to expand those courses and offer places to more people willing to study medicine. But it must be just so difficult for the students who are leaving school this year. The number of students waiting for confirmation from universities exceeding 250,000 for the first ever time. And also the number of candidates with no offers at all is also at a high. I mean, when I did my exams, I found them hugely stressful. And that was without Twitter and 24-hour news and all these scaremongering headlines, as Kate was talking about. And for these guys who've just finished their exams, a lot of them may not have even sat an exam since they were 11 years old, their year 6 SATs. And they missed out on, this is the year that missed out on taking their GCSEs because of the pandemic. They had to endure 2 years of lockdown. And so a lot of the preparation for doing these things comes from having sat them before. And at least with your A levels, all the adults telling you these are the most important exams you'll ever face, to be in that position having no experience of having sat public exams ever must be terrifying, and particularly at a time when we're saying that because of COVID it's getting so hard to break into the jobs market because people haven't been able to do work experience or everything. I mean, none of us can really sort of imagine what it feels like to be going through what they are at the moment.
Except, Holden, I mean, you're an employer. These are the students who, in 3 or 4 years' time are going to be looking for graduate level jobs, doing the kind of thing that you employ people to do, working on the Week's website, etc. Don't you think that employers are going to bake that in a little bit to their recruiting decisions? This is the generation that was at school during COVID, and therefore you look at them just slightly differently with that in mind.
I think there will have to be that understanding. And I think it's, as time goes by, maybe that is going to fade from employers' memories, but also as time goes by, the grades you got in your A levels become progressively less important. And I think even by the time we're hiring graduates, it's not something I pay a huge amount of attention to. I look much more at how people perform in writing tests, and alongside university degrees and the sort of interest they show. Journalism is a slightly unusual career in that it doesn't have a kind of set of academic requirements, and it's much less rigid in that regard. So I think for people who are kind of thinking about how they might compete with other years and how they're going to be compared with the broader range of people, it is going to be something that they worry about, even if the actual effect it will have on their lives might be slightly smaller than it seems at this point.
I suppose what's quite depressing about this, Kate, is that we kept being told during COVID that the pandemic might provide a sort of reset button on how our education system worked. Perhaps we could have a less test-reliant system. Perhaps we could stop using predicted grades at all, but just only say, apply to university when you've got some qualifications. Then we'll know what you've achieved. None of that's happened, has it? Why is there so little change in what is clearly a non-perfect system?
I think that's a great point, and it does seem as though things have gone back to the way that they were before the pandemic. And actually, there have been some negative repercussions as a result of this. In Scotland, the Scottish Highers results actually came out last week. The overall pass rate for Highers fell, but most significantly, the pass rate for teenagers from the poorest communities in Scotland plummeted, and that's been linked to the reintroduction of formal exams. And that rate actually fell at a far steeper rate than their wealthier peers. So I think the introduction of more coursework, led assessment, and less focus on formal exams as we knew them pre-pandemic actually in some ways was a good thing and helped level the playing field a little. But it does seem like things really have gone back to how they were before. And actually Ofqual, which regulates exams in England, they said that this year's grade boundaries were set roughly between 2019 pre-pandemic levels and the 2021 boundaries. But actually, we're going to see this even more next year because the grades will be brought down further to the same levels as 2019.
I guess also, Julia, because it's just part of our system that parents basically can buy their children an educational advantage by sending them to private schools. You can imagine that a lot of people who don't go to private schools think, well, I'm going to do everything I can to put myself on the same level with those guys. If that involves cheating a bit, then, you know, from my point of view, they're cheating by having been to a school where there are only 12 of them in a class.
I think that's an important point to point out, but also, I mean, if we look at where we are right now, we're in the middle of a cost of living crisis, and you know, the issue of cheating because people are so desperate to get into university is one thing, but the problem doesn't go away once they're at university. And you know, I feel like we have to talk about student loans, because you know 2/3 of university students are reportedly struggling to afford their bills. Nearly 3/4 of them, I read, 73% have had to borrow money from family members to pay for essentials such as food and rent in the past year. And you know, the strain on finances is leading to so many problems. There's a rising number of students who are worried about homelessness. I mean, my university experience, I was really lucky. I went to St Andrews to study English, but I feel like I didn't get a huge amount out of it other than, you know, a sort of coming of age life experience. I remember mostly doing as little work as possible, socializing a ton, and cramming in last minute overnighters to meet my deadlines. In one way, maybe that was perfect introduction and preparation for journalism. But I feel like opening up the world to vocational qualifications, not just university, might be better.
I think all of the discussion around results day, cheating, and the incredible pressure that's on young people at the moment is only going to lead to even more debate over how important uni is anyway. As Julia mentioned, student debt is a huge reason why more people are deciding to go down a different path. And we've definitely seen a focus shift back towards more vocational courses and kind of on-the-job training that allows people to enter the workplace without having a huge amount of student debt accompanying them. So there are definitely pros and cons of going to university. As Julia mentioned, the life lessons that you learn is a really key component. But I think that this is a debate that we're only going to see getting more heated and given more prominence over the next few years.
But sort of forgotten about, Holden, until we get to this point each year in terms of the mainstream news agenda. You know, James Cleverly was doing the rounds yesterday, but education isn't a big talking point, is it, generally? And obviously it's all going to be about cost of living for the next 6 months. So we will just be in this situation again in a year's time, won't we? Seeing the same stories, really.
I'm sure we will. And it does seem that there's a different lens that we put on essentially the same story every year. One point I would like to make on the cheating is that I don't think this is a story about people from poorer educational backgrounds leveling the playing field by cheating. I think if there is more attention to it, what we're probably going to see is it's the people who are most able to take advantage of a situation taking even more advantage. And if you look at the US, where I think this is even more well developed, they had a case in 2019 where the FBI charged 33 parents with paying a total of $25 million to a man who was later convicted of bribing college admission tutors and inflating exam results to get children into Ivy League colleges. So I think that would certainly add a different flavor if we saw that kind of thing happening here in years to come.
Yeah, and the problem certainly isn't political. Otherwise, obviously, Gavin Williamson wouldn't have been knighted. That's it for this week's edition of the show. You can follow us for free and get every episode as soon as it's released by searching for The Week Unwrapped wherever you get your podcasts and tapping follow. Remember, too, to check out our sister show from the week, The Overview. In the meantime, my thanks to Kate, Holden and Julia. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer, Sophie King at Rethink Audio. And until we meet again to Unwrap next week, bye-bye.